She did not weep when he handed her the quill. She did not tremble when 5 packs watched her sign. She simply looked at him once and then looked away. And that, more than anything else she would ever do, was what he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. Stay with this one until the final word. What she does after she signs is not what anyone in that chamber expected. Not the 5-pack alphas seated along the stone walls. Not the council elders who drafted the document. Not the woman in ivory who stood at his side and smiled. And especially not him. Drop your city below if you're watching from somewhere far from here. I want to know how many kingdoms this story is reaching tonight. The great hall of Valethorn Keep had seen wars declared, alliances broken, and blood spilled across its black stone floor in the 400 years since the first Alpha King had planted his seat here. But it had never seen anything quite like this. Ileana Ashvane stood at the center of it. She was 26 years old, slight in the way that people often mistook for weakness until they had been in a room with her long enough to understand the difference between a woman who was small and a woman who had learned to take up exactly the space she needed and no more. Her hair was dark. Her hands were still. She wore no ceremonial dress, no house colors, nothing that announced she had known this morning would require ceremony. She had not been told until 2 hours before it happened. That was the first thing to understand about tonight. She had not been told. The document on the table in front of her was 4 pages long, written in the formal language of the Accord of Five, the ancient covenant that bound the 5 wolf packs of the northern continent under a single crown. It had been drafted by Elder Corvin Thassel, who sat now at the far end of the table with his hands folded and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, in the way of a man who had decided he preferred not to look at the person most affected by what he had written. She had read every word of it in the 2 hours between being handed it in her private chambers by a palace attendant who would not meet her eyes, and being escorted here to this hall by 2 guards who had served under her own household for 3 years, and were now apparently serving someone else's instruction. The document was, in its way, a masterpiece of language. It did not use the word rejection. It used phrases like dissolution of the sacred bond for the purpose of political alignment and voluntary severance in service of pack unity. It used the word voluntary 4 times in 4 pages. She had counted. The hall was arranged along its length with representatives from all 5 packs, Valethorn in black at the near end, Duskmoor in deep green to the left, Ashvin in silver gray to the right, Ironhollow in rust brown beside the far pillar, and Cravenspire, her father's pack, her blood in pale gold at the very back, seated at a distance that told her someone had arranged the seating to make certain her people were the furthest from her when this happened. She had noted that too. At the head of the table stood Alpha King Kaelin Draven. He was the kind of man a room arranged itself around before he had said a word. Tall, built like something hewn from the same black stone as Valethorn's walls, with gray eyes that had always seen more than he bothered to say aloud. She had loved those eyes for 4 years. She had trusted the stillness in them. She had believed the stillness meant depth. She understood now that it had only ever meant distance. Beside him stood Lady Seraphine Voss of Duskmoor. She was beautiful in the way of women who had always known they would be placed in rooms like this one. Pale gold hair dressed simply enough to suggest she hadn't tried, dark eyes that moved across the assembled packs with the smooth, assessing quality of someone who already knew what everyone in the room was worth. She wore ivory, not white, not cream, but the particular ivory that photographs like sunlight and makes everyone standing near it look like they're standing in shadow. She was not looking at Ileana. She did not need to. This was not her moment to watch. It was her moment to simply stand and let the watching happen around her, which was a different and more powerful thing. Kaelin looked at Ileana once as she entered. Something moved through his face, brief, complicated, not quite guilt and not quite resolve. More like the expression of a man who had organized his reasons into a clean row and was now holding them very carefully so none of them spilled before the thing was done. She had seen him plan before. She knew exactly what planning looked like on his face. She simply hadn't known, until 8 weeks ago, that he had been planning this. Ileana. His voice was the voice he used for announcements, measured, carrying, designed for rooms this size. Kaylan, she said back, and her voice came out level. The kind of level that cost something real and did not let it show. He gestured toward the document. You've had time to review it. I have. Then you understand what's being asked. She looked at him a moment. For years, she had held this man through grief so private he had never shown it to another living person. She had sat with him through 3 weeks of nightmares after the Iron Hello War, when he'd wake in the dark with his breathing wrong and not speak, but simply press his forehead to her shoulder until the shaking stopped. She had learned every weight he carried. She had carried several of them herself, quietly, in rooms where no one else could see. She had never once asked him to acknowledge it. She had perhaps, she thought now, made a significant error in that choice. I understand what the document says, she said. That isn't quite the same thing. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not regret, not yet, but the first thin shadow of a man hearing something he had told himself he wouldn't need to hear. The Duskmore Alliance secures our northern passage, he said. 5 packs, Ileana. The accord hasn't held a unanimous. I've read the political reasoning, she said. I drafted 3 of the policies that created the conditions for this alliance. You don't need to explain the reasoning to me. The hall had gone very quiet. 5 packs, 60 pairs of eyes, and the particular silence of people who had come expecting ceremony and were receiving something that hadn't been written into the program. Kaylan stepped forward. He stopped on the opposite side of the table, the document between them like a river neither of them had crossed yet. His voice dropped into the register she knew from private hours, the one stripped of performance. I need you to sign this. I know, she said. Then, I know, she said again, differently. I know what you need. That's always been the thing I knew most clearly. He looked at her, and she made herself look back fully, without flinching, the way she had always looked at him when the thing between them was real, which it had been. She was certain of that. Whatever it had become now, it had once been entirely real. She picked up the quill. She signed. 4 years of a mate bond. 4 years of building this king's empire from inside his walls, of learning his people and his land and his enemies, of making herself indispensable in rooms she had not been invited into and useful in ways that never appeared in any official record, because she had always understood. Too late she now knew that understanding the machine and being credited for understanding it were 2 entirely different things. She signed her name in full. She set the quill down. She looked at Elder Thassel, who was still studying the middle distance with admirable dedication, and then at the 5-pack representatives seated along the walls, and then, last, deliberately, at Seraphine Voss, who had finally turned to look at her. Their eyes held for exactly 3 seconds. Seraphine smiled. It was a small smile, not cruel, not triumphant, more careful than either of those. The smile of a woman who had won something and was experienced enough not to celebrate loudly. Ileana looked away first. Not because the look defeated her. Because she was already thinking about something else. Something that had been growing steadily in the back of her mind for 6 weeks, since the night she had overheard something she was not supposed to hear, in a corridor she was not supposed to be walking, at an hour when no one had expected her to be awake. She was thinking about her grandmother's voice, telling an old story beside a fire that smelled of pine and river mud, on the Ashvin coast 7 years ago, when Ileana was 19 and newly mated and still learning what it meant to carry a bond that ran deeper than affection. She was thinking about what she was going to do tonight. She folded her hands, and she waited for the ceremony to finish, and her face gave nothing away. 8 weeks before the signing, Ileana had been unable to sleep. This was not unusual. She had never been a natural sleeper in Valethorn. The keep ran cold through the night, even in summer, and the stone walls carried sound in directions that always surprised her. She had learned over 4 years to map the keep's acoustic patterns the way some people map roads, knowing which corridors carried voices from which rooms, which staircases caught the echo of private conversations, and delivered them cleanly to unexpected hallways. She had never deliberately used this knowledge. On the night everything changed, she was simply walking. The east corridor at the second bell of night was empty. She was returning from the archives. She had been working late on a treaty revision for the Ashfin border dispute, the kind of paperwork that moved slowly precisely because it mattered. And she was tired in the particular way of someone who has been doing difficult, careful work for hours in complete solitude. She heard Kaylen's voice from the small council room at the corridor's bend, and she almost didn't stop. Almost. She doesn't need to know until it's settled. His voice was low but unhurried, the voice of a man who believed himself unheard. Settled meaning signed. That was Elder Thassel, dry, administrative, the verbal equivalent of a document. Meaning announced. The signing is a formality once the announcement is made. She's not a woman who causes scenes. A pause. She'll understand the necessity. A third voice, Kaylen's war commander, Aldrich Payne, whose voice Ileana had learned to recognize by the careful way he chose words that didn't commit him fully to anything. The bond will need to be formally dissolved before the Voss contract can be sealed. Wording matters. The Ashfin girl's bloodline is not a complication, Kaylen said. Her father's pack is mid-ranking at best. There's nothing in the Ashfin line that challenges the dissolution. The Ashfin girl. 4 years. She had translated 3 peace treaties, restructured the pack tax system to prevent the border wars that would have consumed 2 generations of wolves, personally negotiated the Iron Hello grain accord that had fed an entire northern territory through 2 hard winters. All of it from inside rooms where her name appeared on no official documentation, because no one had ever thought to put it there. And she was the Ashfin girl. She stood in the cold corridor and did not move and did not breathe, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not break, she had expected eventually. On some level she had refused to look at directly, that something like this might come. The Duskmore alliance had been discussed in council for 2 years. She had noticed the shifts in how Kaylen spoke about it. She had noticed the name Seraphine Voss appearing in more dispatches than the Northern Passage alone required. She had chosen not to pull that thread, because she had not wanted to find what was at the end of it. She had been wrong to wait. What shifted in her chest was not the feeling of something breaking. It was the feeling of something extremely heavy finally being set down on a solid surface after she had been carrying it in her arms for a very long time. She turned and walked back to her chambers, and she sat in the dark, and she did not let herself feel the full weight of what she had just heard. Not yet. There was something she needed to remember first. Her grandmother's story. Ileana's grandmother, Vera Ashfin, who had been old and small and entirely unbothered by the opinions of anyone living or dead, had sat beside a fire on the coast 7 years ago and told a story she called the First Dissolution. A story that had been passed through the Ashfin women for 11 generations, told as a lullaby with a long memory in it. There had once, Vera said, been a mate bond severed before its time, not by death, by choice, by force, by a document signed in public in the way of men who believe that power is the same as permission. And the wolf who had been released, not freed, released, the way a rope is released when its load becomes too heavy for the hand holding it, had done something that no rejected mate had done before or since. She had not run. She had not wept. She had returned to the source. What source? Ileana had asked at 19, only half listening, more interested in the fire's warmth than in old stories. Her grandmother had smiled. The blood that was in us before the bonds, before the pacts, before the kings. She had tapped the inside of her own wrist where a faint mark sat like an old scar. Every Ashfin woman carries it, most never need it, but it's there, waiting. Ileana had not thought of that story again. Not until she sat in the dark in Valethorn Keep 8 weeks before the signing, and felt something old and patient stir underneath the weight she had just set down, like something that had been sleeping a long time and heard, at last, its name called. In the 6 weeks between the corridor and the signing, Eliana learned something she had not expected. The life she had built inside Kaelan's keep was both larger and more invisible than she had realized. She had known, in the practical way of someone who does the work, that she held a significant amount of what made Valethorn function. She had not, until she sat down and traced every thread, understood the full shape of it. It was one thing to know you were carrying a heavy load. It was another thing entirely to set it down on a flat surface and look at exactly how many pieces made up its weight. She began to trace it systematically, not out of anger. Anger was a fire that burned quickly and left you with less than you started with, and she had never been careless with her own resources. She began out of the precision that had always been her clearest and most privately held quality. The same precision that had once made Kaelan look across a council table when she was 22 and newly arrived and say, with the tone of a man who was genuinely surprised to find something in a place he hadn't looked for it, "Where did you learn to read a treaty like that?" She had learned it from her grandmother, from watching, from caring about the right things, but she had simply said from practice because she had understood even then that the full answer would require the room to expand in ways it wasn't ready to yet. She began to write it down. Every policy she had shaped, every negotiation she had guided, every relationship she had cultivated with the pack representatives who had sat in that great hall and watched her sign. The Iron Hello Grain Accord, the one that had kept an entire northern territory fed through 2 bad winters. She had found the structural loophole that made it workable in a late-night session that she had attended alone because Kaelan had been unavailable and someone had needed to be there. The Ashvin border dispute, 3 years of careful relationship building with a pack representative who had initially refused to engage with Valethorn at all, until Eliana had gone to him directly, without ceremony, and sat with him for 6 hours over maps and tea and honest conversation, and the dispute had shifted. She had proposed the solution that everyone else had been too invested in their own positions to suggest, because it required all parties to give something, and she had known how to frame giving as strength rather than concession. The River Rights Agreement with Duskmore itself, the very alliance that now provided the political excuse for her dissolution. She had laid the groundwork for that negotiation 18 months ago in a private conversation with a Duskmore trading delegate at the edge of a council dinner. She had noticed him standing apart from the main group with the expression of a man who had something to say and no clear channel for saying it, and she had gone to him. They had spoken for 40 minutes. She had understood within 10 minutes what he actually needed, and she had found the language that let him feel heard. And 3 weeks later, the trade framework had moved forward in ways that the official council had spent 4 months failing to advance. None of that was in any record. Informal conversations did not appear in official documentation. Relationships built outside formal channels did not appear in formal reports. Solutions proposed by someone who was not authorized to formally propose things got folded quietly into the proposals of people who were, and the origin became invisible as soon as it was no longer needed. She had known this was happening. She had allowed it because her goal had always been the outcome and not the credit. And because she had believed, she forced herself to be honest about this in the dark of her own chambers, that love was its own kind of recognition, that the man she shared a bond with had seen what she was doing even when no document acknowledged it. She had been wrong about that. Not wrong that Kaelan had loved her. She was still certain the love had been real. She was wrong that love could substitute for clear sight. A man could love a woman completely and still fail to see her work because he had grown so accustomed to its results that the work itself had become invisible. The way you stop seeing the foundation of a house because the walls above it are the thing you live inside. She had filled 3 private journals in 6 weeks. On the evening of the 4th week, a woman knocked on her chamber door. Her name was Isolde Farron. She was 34, quiet in the way that watchful people are quiet, not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but the silence of someone who has learned to be selective about what they say aloud and when. She had been Ileana's personal attendant for 3 years. In that time, she had never once overstepped, never gossiped, never positioned herself in the particular way of attendants who understand that proximity to power is its own form of currency and spend it accordingly. She entered with a piece of correspondence she had been asked to deliver through official channels, but she set it down on the desk and then did not leave, which was unusual. She stood near the door with her hands folded and her eyes meeting Ileana's directly. "There is something you should know," Isolde said, without preamble. The voice of a woman who had been weighing a decision for a long time and had finally concluded that the weight of not speaking was heavier than the weight of what would happen when she did. "Tell me," Ileana said. "The council voted on the dissolution 6 weeks before you were told." Isolde's voice stayed level. Lord Aldrich moved the initial motion. Elder Thassel drafted the terms. The Alpha King approved it in the 4th council session. A pause that was not quite silence, more like the space around a word that is still landing. Lady Voss had already visited the keep 3 times before the announcement. The visits were recorded as diplomatic calls regarding the Northern Passage trade review. They were not recorded as anything else. Ileana set her pen down carefully. She did not let her expression change. She had been practicing not letting her expression change for 4 years in a keep full of people who read faces the way other people read weather. "How do you know this?" she asked. "Because I carry the correspondence through the East Wing," Isolde said simply. "I have done it for 3 years. I know which letters go to which offices and who reads them before they arrive. And because," she paused, one small pause where the professional composure showed its one seam, "because I have been deciding for 6 weeks whether the Luna of this keep deserves to know what is being decided about her life in rooms she has not been invited into. I decided she does." The silence between them afterward was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of air after a door opens, a small rush of change, and then a settling. "Thank you," Ileana said. "Is there anything you need me to do?" Ileana looked at the journals stacked on the corner of her desk. At the 3 pages she had been working on that evening, the Ashfin Water rights documentation, the finalization of a verbal agreement between 2 pack elders that existed nowhere in writing, because she had always handled it personally, and the 2 elders trusted her word over any parchment. She thought about what it meant that her word was reliable enough to hold a water rights arrangement for 3 years, and that the same accord that depended on that arrangement had just handed her a dissolution document and asked her to sign it before 5 packs. "Nothing yet," she said, "but I'll ask when there is." Isolde left without further ceremony, and the absence of ceremony was its own kind of eloquence. Alone again, Ileana pressed both palms flat against the desk and let the room's silence become real around her. She thought of her grandmother's story. She thought of the mark on Vera's wrist, which she had always believed was simply a scar from an old injury, and had never questioned closely because it had seemed impolite to ask. She pressed 2 fingers to the inside of her own wrist, where the mate bond sat beneath her skin like a second, quieter heartbeat. She had stopped feeling it as something distinct from herself somewhere around the 2nd year, because it had become so woven into her ordinary sensation that it no longer registered as separate. A warmth she had stopped nomming because nomming required noticing, and noticing required the kind of attention she had been directing elsewhere. She was noticing it now. She thought about what her grandmother had said about the blood that existed before the bonds, before the pacts, before the kings and the houses and the documents signed in great halls before 50 witnesses. She had given this keep 4 years. She had given it her intelligence, her care, her patience, her grief, her love, and the particular kind of loyalty that doesn't announce itself because it is too busy actually being loyal to spend time performing it. She had 6 weeks left to understand what she was taking back. 3 days after the signing, Seraphine Voss came to Ileana's chambers. Not through a messenger, not by formal announcement. She came herself, knocked on the door herself, and entered the way someone enters a room when they have rehearsed this exact moment carefully and decided to perform it as though it is entirely spontaneous. She was wearing a soft blue this time. The deliberate softness of it was itself a statement. Ileana was at her desk, working through the last of the journals. She did not stand when Seraphine entered. She looked up and set her pen down and waited. "I wanted to speak with you without the ceremony of the hall," Seraphine said. Her voice was low and measured, and had the quality of someone who had learned early that how a thing is said shapes what it means more completely than the words themselves. "Then speak," Ileana said. Seraphine moved to the chair across the desk and sat without being invited. A choice. Ileana marked it without commenting. "I understand this has been difficult." "Do you?" "I'm not here to." Seraphine stopped herself. She looked at Ileana with eyes that were more complicated than Ileana had permitted herself to examine closely until now. "I want you to know that I did not enter this arrangement carelessly." "I'm sure you didn't," Ileana said. "It's a very clean arrangement. Someone put real thought into the details." A small pause. "My house has been in alliance negotiations with Valethorn for 2 years. My father and Elder Thassel began the terms before I had been fully informed of what they intended." She held Ileana's gaze. "I am not saying that to excuse the outcome. I'm saying it because I think you are the kind of person who wants the full picture rather than the partial one." Ileana looked at her for a long moment. Seraphine was not what she had expected. That was the honest answer. She had spent the last 3 days thinking of Seraphine as a piece on a board, placed there by other hands, and that had been, she was beginning to understand, an incomplete way of seeing her. "You have a talent for the southern trade routes," Ileana said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was an observation. "I read your family's position papers 18 months ago when I was working on the Duskmore framework. You wrote the 3rd section yourself. There's a way of reading policy arguments that tells you who actually wrote them." Something shifted very slightly in Seraphine's expression. Not surprise, she was too controlled for that, but the faintest adjustment of a woman who had not expected to be seen in that particular direction. "I did write it," she said. "You're better at this than you've been permitted to show," Ileana said. "That isn't a compliment to the men who arranged this. It's just true." Seraphine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" The question had weight. Real weight, the kind that doesn't come from calculation but from genuine uncertainty. Ileana looked at her journals. Then at the window, where morning light was cutting through the stone in the particular way it did at this hour. The way she had been watching for 4 years and had never mentioned to anyone because there had never seemed to be a reason to. "Something that hasn't been done before," she said. Seraphine held her gaze. "Should I be concerned?" "Not about yourself," Ileana said, and then, because it was simply true and she was done spending honesty only on the people who had earned it. "You're in a position someone else designed for you. I understand what that feels like." She returned to her journals. Seraphine sat a moment longer. Then she rose, and at the door she paused in the way of a woman who had planned the pause. "The East Receiving Chamber," she said. "Kalen mentioned I might use it for morning audiences. It's been freed up since your schedule shifted toward the private wing." The East Receiving Chamber had been Ileana's for 3 years. She had commissioned the territorial maps on its walls. She had held the private conversations there that had kept 3-pack alliances from dissolving into border skirmishes. Kalen had offered it away without asking. Seraphine had come to collect it in person. "It belongs to the keep," Ileana said. "Use it however serves the accord." "You're very composed." "I've had practice," Ileana said, and meant it in more directions than Seraphine was likely to understand yet. When the door closed, she sat in the silence of her own office, and she felt the full shape of what had just been taken from her, and she allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to feel it. Then she opened the journal to the next page, and she kept working. The thread she had left to close numbered 41. She had 19 days. On the 9th night after the signing, Kaelin came to find her. No guards. No Aldrich at his shoulder with the carefully blank face of a man executing someone else's decision. No elder Thassel with a document and his eyes fixed on the middle distance. Just him, in the plain clothes she remembered from the years before the Iron Hello War changed the texture of his face. The dark wool, no insignia, the clothes of a man who had enough private hours to wear something that wasn't performing the weight of his title. He stood in the doorway of her study looking like a man who had not slept in several days. She knew this without asking, because the dissolved bond had not fully silenced yet. It was thinning, fraying at the edges the way old rope thins, and through what remained of it she could still feel the baseline truth of his physical state. She had always been able to read him through it. It had taken her 2 years to understand that this was not the same as him reading her. "You're still here," he said. "I live here," she said, "for now." He came into the room and did not sit in the formal chair or the guest chair or the chair across the desk, the way someone comes into a room for a meeting. He sat in the windowsill, sideways, one knee up, exactly the way he had used to sit in the years when this had simply been a room they shared together rather than a room they were both navigating carefully. It was the posture of a man whose body remembered something his situation had stopped making room for. She watched him do it and felt the particular ache of witnessing an old habit arrive in a new context, still shaped by what used to be true. "The council expects you to take a formal household position," he said. "Advisor to the new Luna or a senior administrative consultancy under Elder Thassels." "I know what the council expects," she said. "They wrote it into a secondary document that wasn't included in my original review package. I found it in the correspondence archive on the 3rd day." She looked at him steadily. "Elder Thassel uses a very specific filing system. I helped design it." He exhaled through his nose. "Ileana." "I'm not angry," she said, and she meant it in the precise way she meant everything, not as a reassurance to him, but as a true statement about her own interior. She was not burning. She was not raw. She was something colder than anger and more permanent. She was finished. There was an important difference between those states, and she had spent 4 years learning to name her own states accurately. "I need you to understand the position I was in," he said. "I understand it exactly." She set her pen down and turned to face him fully. "You needed the Northern Passage secured. The Duskmore territory controls every trade artery into the upper reach of the Accord. The mate bond was specifically an obstacle to the contract terms because Duskmore's house conditions required a clean alliance, no existing bond outside the original 5 founding bloodlines." She held his gaze without flinching. "I understood the reasoning the first time you declined to explain it to me, which was in the corridor 8 weeks ago when I heard you discuss it through a wall. I haven't needed the repetition since." He went still. "You heard that." "I built the intelligence network that maps this keep's acoustic patterns," she said simply. "Yes, I heard it." He was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that isn't comfortable but is at least honest. "You make it sound like a business arrangement," he said finally, roughly. "Like I sat down and calculated." "You did calculate," she said, not unkindly. "That isn't an insult. You're a good king, Kaelin. Calculation is part of good kingship. The problem isn't that you calculated. The problem is what you included in the calculation and what you left out." He moved from the windowsill. She had expected this. He never stayed still when something was sitting heavily on him. He crossed the room the way he moved when something was working through him too fast for ordinary stillness, and stopped near the desk. Near her. Close enough that she felt the absence of the bond with new sharpness, the particular quality of empty space that tells you a thing existed there by the specific shape of the hole it left. "I know what you did for this keep," he said. His voice had dropped into the register she knew from private hours, stripped of its public weight. "I know what you built here. Aldrich told me, in considerable and uncomfortable detail, 2 days after the signing, that 3 of the Accord's most stable pack relationships run through your personal connections, and not through any official channel I can claim or transfer or document. That they exist because of conversations you had in rooms I wasn't in, and trust you built before I understood what I was watching you build. Yes, she said. I didn't, he stopped himself, restarted. I failed to understand what I was dismantling. You understood the Duskmore contract, she said quietly. You did not understand me. Those are 2 separate failures, and only one of them is a surprise. He looked at her the way he used to look at her in the early years, not through her, not past her to the next thing requiring his attention, but directly at her, with the full weight of his gray eyes and whatever moved behind them. She had spent 4 years learning to love what she saw when he looked at her that way. She still saw it now. That was the thing about love that no document could reach. It did not dissolve because you signed your name to something. But it could become something you had to carry alone, and she was done carrying things alone. There's a grief I never told you about, she said. He went very still. In the second year, while you were at the Eastern border talks for 6 weeks, I lost. She stopped, made herself finish it because she had been carrying this particular thing without ever once letting it be real in a shared space, and she needed it to have been real before she left this room for good. I lost something I had not told you about yet because the timing was wrong and I had been waiting for the right moment, and then there was no longer anything to tell you. She looked at the desk surface. I handled it with my healer. It was handled. I told myself the Accord needed your focus and I would manage it, and I did. She looked back up. But I managed it alone, in a room by myself while you were a kingdom away. And I never once considered telling you because I had built a practice of not asking you to carry things I could manage on my own. I thought that was love, protecting you from the weight. A pause. I understand now that it was also a way of preventing you from seeing the full shape of what being bonded to you actually cost me. And that was my own failure, not yours. The silence in the room had changed quality. It was heavier now, more honest. Kalen pressed one hand flat against the desk surface. His jaw was working. She could see the calculation in him, the king's instinct to find the response that addressed the problem, to fix, to resolve. And she could see it failing because some things could not be fixed. Some things could only be witnessed. I'm sorry, he said, 2 words, plain, no architecture of explanation around them. She looked at him. I know, she said. That's the right thing to say. A year ago it would have meant more. What would have meant something a year ago? Asking, she said, simply asking. In the ordinary way. How are you? What do you need? What have you been carrying? Any of it. She held his gaze steadily. You stopped asking around the 18th month. I noticed and I told myself you were managing the border negotiations and I would wait until the pressure lifted. The pressure never lifted because there is always pressure in a keep like this one. And then 2 years had passed. He had no answer for that. The honest ones never did. She let him sit in it, not cruelly, simply because the truth deserved the space to land completely. You could have told me yourself, she said, not through a corridor wall, not through Isolde's quiet courage, not in a document drafted without my involvement and announced before 5 packs in a hall I decorated. You could have told me yourself, months ago, when I still had time to respond as a person rather than a witness to a decision that had already been made. I know, he said. 2 words, she said, and her voice, for the first time all evening, carried the heat of something she had been keeping sealed. Not rage, not accusation, just the plain, real weight of it. 2 words, and you found every possible way to say them to 5 packs and a room full of nobility before you found a way to say them to me. He was silent, the silence of a man who had arrived at the place past which argument could not go. She let herself feel the full truth of him, the love that had been real, the grief that was also real, the specific and unanswerable fact of a person who had been genuinely important to her and had also genuinely failed her, and that both of those things were equally true and neither of them could cancel the other. Get some rest, she said finally, and her voice had come back down from the heat. Your keep needs you rested. He stood there another moment. She could feel him wanting to say something more, some final thing, some reconfiguration of the evening into a shape that felt less final. She could feel him deciding not to. His footsteps crossed the room and disappeared into the corridor. She sat alone and listened to the keep settle into its night sounds around her. The wind in the eastern walls, a door closing 2 floors below, the faint, distant rhythm of the kitchen still moving through their late work. Then she opened the journals. 28 threads remaining. 19 days had become 9. She worked until the candle burned twice through, and the window went from black to dark gray to the particular pale gold of very early morning. She did not sleep. She did not need to quite yet. There would be time for sleep on the other side of this, somewhere past the boundary markers, where the river ran fast and clean over pale stone, and the ground was difficult and entirely, completely hers. On the 14th night after the signing, Ileana sent a letter. Not through the palace post. She was not naive about who read the palace post. She sent it through Isolde, carried on a personal errand that the palace records would show as a supply run to the eastern market town. The letter was addressed to a woman named Vora Ashvane, her grandmother's youngest sister, 81 years old, who lived in a hill settlement 3 days east of the coast, and was, as far as Ileana knew, the last living keeper of the old stories. The letter said only, I need to know if the door is still open, and I need to know how to find the stone. She sealed it in a language only Ashvin women used, not a written code but a folding pattern in the paper, a way of sealing correspondence that the women of her bloodline had passed down through generations not as ceremony, but as a practical tool for a family that had learned across the centuries to communicate in ways that the people around them could not read. She gave it to Isolde at dawn. No record, she said. Isolde tucked it into her coat. Yes, my Luna, she paused. They've begun routing the morning briefings through Lord Aldrich's office. Ileana had known this was coming. How many of the administrative staff? 5 that I know of, probably more by the week's end. Thank you, she meant it each time she said it. Alone, she turned back to the journals. The threads were closing, 18 remaining. She was working faster now, not because she had grown careless, but because she had grown clear. Clarity was its own form of speed. She wrote to the Iron Hello Pack representative, formalizing a 3-year grain arrangement that had previously existed only in the trust between 2 people who shook hands over dinner. She wrote to the Ashvin border administrators, encoding the procedural memory of how the water rights dispute worked into a document that would survive her departure without losing its internal logic. She met with Aldrich Payne, who had the grace, at least, to look directly at her and not through her, and she walked him through the Duskmore trade framework she had built over 18 months, calmly, completely, without withholding a single piece of it, because what she had done here had been done for the wolves who depended on this accord, and she would not punish them to make a point. You're making sure it survives without you, Aldrich said, watching her with something that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite remorse but lived in the space between them. I built it to last, she said, not to need me. He was quiet a moment. That was always the difference between you and most of the people in this keep. She filed that away with everything else she was filing and kept working. On the 16th day, Vora Ashvin's reply arrived, folded in the same pattern Ileana had used. Isolde brought it at dawn without a word. Ileana opened it at her desk in the gray light before the keep woke. The door has been open since before you were born, child. I wondered when you would remember it was yours. Beneath the low hills east of the Ashvin coast, where the river bends twice at the old boundary markers, there is a stone. You will know it when you stand before it because it will know you first. It holds the memory of what was sealed there 11 generations ago, and it has been waiting for the blood of the line that sealed it. But read this next part carefully, and do not read it lightly. What you carry on your wrist is not only a mate bond. The Ashvin bloodline was one of the founding lines of the Accord of Five, a history the great houses buried when they rewrote the founding records 300 years ago. Our blood is woven into the accord itself, not as ornament, as structure. If you release what was placed on you against the full terms of the original agreement, placed on you publicly, before the 5 packs, without your true consent, you will not simply dissolve a mate bond. You will send a pulse through the accord's foundation. Every alpha bound to the ward will feel it. Every pack representative who sat in that hall will feel it in their blood and their bones. They will not understand what they are feeling, but they will fear it. And they should. Come to the stone when you are ready, not before. The stone will not answer an unready woman. Ileana read it twice. Then she set it down on the desk and sat with both hands flat on the wood and let the weight of it become real inside her. She had known, distantly, the story her grandmother used to tell. She had never considered that it might be literally, structurally true. That the bond on her wrist was not simply a mating mark, but a thread in the foundation that held 5 packs in fragile peace. She sat with that for a long time. Then she thought about the corridor, the Ashvin girl, the 4 pages that used the word voluntary 4 times, the documents drafted without her knowledge, decided without her voice, announced without her preparation. She thought about every wolf in the 5-pack territories whose grain agreements, water rights, border securities, and trade relationships had been held together quietly by a woman whose name appeared in no official record. She thought about what it meant that the peace those wolves lived under had been built, in part, in the ways that mattered most on her silence, her absence from credit, her willingness to hold the weight invisibly. If the foundation cracked when she stopped holding it, she thought quietly, then it had always been more fragile than anyone allowed themselves to see. She picked up her pen, she went back to the journals. 4 threads remaining. She would be ready in 3 days. On the 18th night, Ileana packed nothing. That was harder than she had expected. Not because of the practical difficulty, she had always traveled light, preferred it, had learned early that the things you carry define the pace you're able to move at. It was hard because standing in a room where 4 years of a life had accumulated, and understanding that none of it was coming with her, was a different thing than understanding it as a concept. Her books, the hand-drawn map of the Iron Hello territory she had commissioned herself from a cartographer she had found through a council trade contact, and had trusted with precision down to the waterway markings. The small wooden carving on her windowsill, a wolf in mid-stride, given to her in the first year by a trader from the Cravenspire market, whose name she had never thought to write down but whose face she had never forgotten, because he had pressed it into her hands with the gravity of a man who believed small objects carried real weight. She looked at it for a long time. She left it on the sill. Whoever came to this room next would find it, and maybe it would mean something to them that it hadn't meant to its original owner, and that felt right. She dressed in traveling clothes. She looked at herself once in the dark mirror, a woman who looked back with eyes that were not empty, not broken, but fundamentally and at last entirely her own. She sat at her desk and wrote one final page, not to Kaelan, not to the court or the council or the 5-pack representatives who would spend the next months learning exactly what she had been holding together. She wrote to the 22-year-old girl she had been when she arrived at Valethorn with a newly placed bond on her wrist and the particular terror and hope of someone entering a life they hadn't fully chosen, trying to prove she deserved to be there. She told that girl, "You were always enough. The room was always the wrong shape for what you actually were. That was never your failure." She sealed it. She left it on the pillow. She picked up the traveling bag she had packed 2 days earlier, light, practical, 3 days of supplies and the 4 journals, which were the only things in this room that were irrefutably, documentably hers. She walked out without looking back. The keep was quiet at the 3rd bell of night. She moved through it the way she had always moved through it, unhurried, familiar, belonging where she was. The guards she passed had watched her walk these corridors for 4 years. None of them registered anything unusual in a woman moving through halls she had always occupied. She had built that quality deliberately, the kind of belonging that looks like it has always been there. She almost reached the eastern gate. Kalen was at the junction before the outer passage. No guards, no insignia, just him, standing in the cold with the look of a man who had not slept in 4 days and had finally stopped pretending he was going to. He looked at her traveling clothes, at the bag, at her face in the dim torchlight of the corridor. Now, he said, one word, not a question. Yes, she said. He crossed the distance in 4 steps and stopped in front of her, close enough that she felt the warmth of him, close enough that whatever remained of the dissolved bond registered his nearness in some deep place below reason. His hand rose and settled against the side of her face, not gripping, not restraining, just his hand, the size and weight and roughness of it exactly as she had known it through 4 years of private hours, good ones and terrible ones, and all the ordinary ones in between that she now understood had been the most valuable of all. She felt it move through her like a current, and she locked every muscle against what it cost her. Don't, he said, and his voice had no performance left in it, raw and rough and present in a way she hadn't heard since the worst nights of the Iron Hello War. Ileana, don't walk out of this keep. She let herself feel every layer of it, the love that had been real, the grief underneath, the specific, particular ache of standing close to the person you had built your most private life with and knowing, with complete, clear certainty, that you were leaving anyway. You should have thought about this before the document, she said softly, before the ceremony, before 5 packs and a quill and a woman in ivory standing where I should have been standing. I know. His voice broke on those 2 words in a way that all his speeches never had. I know that. I am asking you. You are asking me to stay in a house that has already decided what to do with me, she said. You are asking me to be useful inside a life that has already named me replaceable. And you are doing it with your hand on my face at midnight because that is the version of asking you have left, and I think some part of you understands that it's too late for it. His jaw worked. His hand was still there. She reached up and took it, held it for one full moment, felt the warmth and the weight and the roughness of it, pressed her fingers into his palm the way she had 100 times in private, in dark hours, in the real life they had briefly shared. Then she lowered it. You have everything you need to run this accord, she said. I made certain of that. The threads are closed. The documentation exists. Your people know what to do. She held his gaze. What happens next in those territories is the work of those people, not mine, not anymore. He exhaled, and the sound of it was enormous. The sound of a man arriving at the place past which no amount of authority or regret could carry him. She stepped around him. He did not stop her. She heard him breathe behind her as she walked away. Once, unsteady, the kind of breath that belongs to someone sitting with the full weight of a thing they cannot undo. She did not look back. The eastern gate opened. The night was cold and wide and entirely indifferent, and she walked into it and let it close behind her. The stone stood on a rise above the river bend east of the Ashvin coast, half buried in moss older than any record she had been able to find that acknowledged it existed. She arrived on the 3rd night of travel, alone, on horseback through country that thinned gradually from settled pack territory into land that older maps labeled with the phrase unaccorded boundary, meaning it belonged to no house and no pack and no king. It simply existed, the way land does when it has been there longer than the people arguing over it. Vora Ashvin met her at the edge of a narrow hill path, in the last gray light before full dark. She was small and white-haired and entirely unhurried, and she looked at Ileana for a long moment without speaking, the way a woman looks at someone she has been expecting and is checking against her own internal picture. You look like your grandmother, she said finally, around the eyes. I know, Ileana said. She told me. She would. Vora turned up the path. Come inside, eat first. The stone will wait. Inside a low stone house that smelled of dried herbs and old timber, Ileana sat and ate warm bread and river fish, and did not speak and did not need to. Because Vora had clearly understood across 8 decades of living that some arrivals required food before words, and she honored that without comment. Only after the food was gone, and the fire had settled did Vora speak. You need to understand what you're doing before you stand at that stone, she said. Not the mechanics, the meaning. Tell me. The Accord of Five was sealed 300 years ago by 5 bloodlines who agreed to bind their wolves together under a single peace. Vora's voice had the quality of someone reciting something memorized not from text, but from oral transmission across generations. 5 bloods, 5 bindings, 1 ward. The founding records that exist in Valethorn's archive were rewritten 40 years after the founding to erase the names of the original bloodlines and replace them with the great houses. Politics. She said the word the way you say a word you have long since stopped being surprised by. The Ashvin line was one of the 5. Ileana was quiet. She was not shocked, she found. She had been moving toward this knowledge for weeks and had begun to feel its shape before it was fully named. The mate bond that was placed on me, she said. Is woven into the ward, Vora said. Yes, all bonds in the founding bloodlines are. It is what made the Accord stable bonds that connected to the ward's foundation rather than sitting above it. She paused. A bond placed on an Ashvin woman and then dissolved by force by public ceremony, under duress before the 5 packs is not simply a personal severance. It is a structural event. The ward will recognize it. And when I go to the stone and complete the release, every alpha in the Accord will feel the ward shift. Vora held her gaze. It will feel to them like the ground moved, like something they had been standing on without knowing it was there has suddenly made itself known. Ileana looked at the fire for a long moment. She thought about the farmers in Ironhollow whose grain agreement she had built over 2 years and documented carefully before she left, so it would survive. She thought about the Ashvin families along the disputed border and the water rights arrangement, and the 3 years of careful trust between herself and the pack representative, whose name she had encoded into a document that would outlast her involvement in any of it. She thought about the 5 alphas who had sat in that hall and watched her sign, some of them with careful eyes, and some of them with no eyes at all, because they had been looking at the new arrangement rather than the woman it was being arranged around. They will fear it, she said. Yes. Good, she said quietly, not with satisfaction, with the particular, clear feeling of someone who has decided that the truth being felt is better than the truth being invisible. They should have been paying attention long before tonight. Vora looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once slowly, with the expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time for someone to say a particular thing out loud. Then let's go to the stone, she said. The warding stone was older than its moss. She felt that when she put her hand on it, the particular sensation of touching something that was not simply old but foundational, the way the deepest bedrock feels different from the soil above it even when you can't see the difference. The sky above the river bend was fully dark, the moon high and completely round, and the stone's surface under her palm was cold enough that the cold had its own texture. Vora stood 15 paces back. She had said everything that needed saying. The rest belonged to Ileana. The mate bond on Ileana's wrist had been thinning since the signing. That was the nature of a dissolved bond. It did not vanish immediately. It unwound, the way a rope unwound when the tension holding it was released. She could still feel the last threads of it, faint and fraying, like the final few fibers of something that had been whole. She drew the small blade Vora had pressed into her hands at the doorway. She looked at the mark on her wrist, the pale crescent that had sat there for 4 years, that she had stopped really looking at somewhere in the 2nd year, because it had become so familiar it had become invisible, the way important things do when you see them every day. She pressed the blade to the mark. She did not think of Kaelan, not in that moment. She thought of the 22-year-old girl who had arrived at Valethorn frightened and determined, and already more capable than any room she entered would allow her to show. She thought of every grain negotiation, every border arrangement, every quiet thread woven into the Accord's daily life by hands that no record acknowledged. She thought of Isolde's courage. She thought of Aldrich's complicated, inadequate remorse. She thought of Seraphine's letter, which she had not yet received but which she somehow, in the deep place below logic, already knew was coming. She thought of her grandmother's voice beside a fire, telling a story that turned out to be not a story at all. "I release what was given freely and taken carelessly," she said. Her voice was steady in the moonlight, carried by no performance, just the plain sound of a woman speaking the plainest truth of her life. "I release the bond that was dissolved in public before my consent was real. I release the mark that was given by a man who mistook what I offered freely for something he could decide to end without asking." The mark began to glow. Not brightly, not in the dramatic way of the old tailies. Softly, the way something glows when it is releasing stored light rather than generating new light. A slow, silver warmth rising off the skin of her wrist like morning mist off a river, gentle and enormous. "I am the blood of the founding line," she said. "I am the blood that was woven into this accord before the great houses had names, and before the records were rewritten, and before anyone in 5 kingdoms thought to wonder why the peace held as steadily as it did." She pressed her palm harder against the stone. "I do not release this lightly. I release it because what was done to me was not light. And I release it so that every alpha in this accord understands, in their blood and in their bones, that the foundation they have been standing on was never a thing they built alone." The stone beneath her palm answered. It was a vibration first, deep, subsonic, the kind you feel in your chest before your ears register it. Then something moved through her that she could only describe afterward as recognition, the way a key and a lock recognize each other, ancient and certain and completely without ceremony. The mark tore free. It was not painless. She had not expected it to be. Pain was the price of things that matter, and she had always been willing to pay that price when the thing was real. The pulse moved outward from her like a stone dropped into still water, visible to no eye, but felt in every body bonded to the Accord's ward, moving through hills and rivers and packed territories with the speed of something that exists below the surface of ordinary sensation. She stood at the stone with her wrist pale and bare in the moonlight and felt, for the first time in 4 years, like a woman, standing inside her own skin without anything else attached. 300 miles north, in the great hall of Valethorn Keep, Kaelan Draven stopped mid-sentence in front of his evening council and pressed his fist to his chest and went to one knee before he understood what was happening. The bond, dissolved by document, dissolved by ceremony, dissolved by everything he had arranged and signed and decided, tore away from the other end, with a finality that no document had prepared him for. He knelt on the black stone floor of the keep that bore his name and understood with painful, complete clarity the difference between releasing a bond and having a bond released. They were not the same thing. They had never been the same thing. In the Duskmoor territories, a pack alpha woke from a dead sleep with his hand on his chest, and the sensation of a bell struck somewhere underground, resonant, shaking the floor in a way no tremor accounted for. In Ironhollow, the alpha matriarch stopped in the middle of her night watch and looked south and felt, in her oldest and deepest instincts, the sensation of a load-bearing thing shifting, not breaking, shifting, announcing itself, after having been invisible for years, making itself known. In Ashfin and Cravenspire, 2 more alphas felt the same in the same moment. A tremor in the Accord's foundation that carried no name with it but carried, unmistakably, the quality of something feminine and ancient and long overdue making its weight known. By the following morning, urgent correspondence had begun moving between all 5 pack seats. None of them knew what they had felt. All of them were afraid of it. And all of them, Every last one began to ask the same question. What just happened to the Accord's foundation, and who did it? The settlement past the old boundary markers was not large. 20 wolves lived there when Eliana arrived, in low stone buildings set against a hillside above the river bend, built by hands that had needed somewhere to go after being told by the structures they trusted that there was no longer room for them. Vora had not built it as a refuge, exactly. Refuge implied temporary shelter from something that would eventually pass. Vora had built it as a proof that belonging could be constructed out of will and work rather than inherited through bloodlines or sealed by bonds. That difficult ground was still ground, that the right hands could find a way to grow something in it. Eliana spent the first 3 weeks doing very little, which was the hardest thing she had done in 4 years. She slept properly, deeply, the kind of sleep that arrived because no part of her was managing something in the background. She had not understood how much of her sleep in the last 2 years had been half sleep, part of her always listening for something that needed managing. In the settlement, nothing needed managing at 3 in the morning. She let herself be unconscious, which felt almost luxurious. She sat with Vora in the evenings by the fire in the main stone room. They talked about small things. The river's winter behavior, how it ran faster on the south bend and calmer on the north, which affected the water drawing for the upper fields. The best season to work the iron-heavy soil on the eastern slope, which repelled most seeds but could be coaxed into yielding certain hardy root crops if you understood what it actually needed rather than what ordinary soil needed. The way certain old words in the Ashvin coastal dialect carried meanings that newer languages had lost the patience for, words for specific kinds of silence, specific qualities of weather, specific emotional states, that required 17 syllables to express in the common tongue, but had once been a single sound in the old language. These were not unimportant conversations. They were, she began to understand, the conversations she had not been permitted to have for 4 years inside a keep where every conversation was a tool and every gathering was a venue. She had not realized how much she missed talking simply because the talking was real and not because it was useful. The wrist where the bond had been did not hurt after the 3rd day. What remained was a pale ring of skin, slightly smoother than the surrounding surface, the way skin looks when something has been held against it long enough to leave a memory in the tissue. She would carry it for the rest of her life. She looked at it once, carefully and without flinching, in the early morning light on the 4th day, turned it slowly in the light and understood what it was evidence of, and then she decided she was done examining the evidence of what had been removed. She would proceed from here, not from there. She worked because working was how she understood the world she was in. It had always been that way. The work was how she learned a new place's bones. She helped with the water channel first. There was a blockage in the eastern branch that had been quietly redirecting flow in ways that undermined the North Field's irrigation for 2 seasons. No one had been able to identify the source because they had been looking at the visible problem rather than what was causing it upstream. She walked the full length of the channel on the 2nd morning, following the water's logic rather than the expected path, and found the blockage in 20 minutes. The solution was modest and structural and required a morning of labor to implement. She helped implement it, carrying stone alongside Breck and 2 other settlement wolves who watched her do it without comment, because in a place where everyone worked, a person who worked was simply a person. She began to see the settlement the way she had always learned the system she worked inside, through its load-bearing structures and its weak points, and the small adjustments that prevented large failures from becoming visible. Where the grain storage needed better ventilation before the summer humidity created moisture problems. Where the path between the lower buildings and the upper field created a bottleneck during morning work hours that added an hour of wasted movement to everyone's day that nobody had named, because they had all simply adapted to it individually rather than solving it collectively. Where 3 separate ongoing tensions between settlement members were not 3 separate problems, but one structural misunderstanding about how shared resources were allocated. which she resolved by sitting with each person involved, separately, in genuine conversation, with full attention, and letting them each feel heard before suggesting the same quiet adjustment to each of them. So the solution arrived as mutual understanding rather than imposed decision. "You've been doing this all your life," Vora said one morning, watching her work through a grain storage problem on a piece of rough parchment. There were numbers and diagrams and 3 alternate solutions sketched out in a margin. "Yes," Ileana said. "Without credit. Without most of it," she set down the pen. "For a long time I told myself the outcome was enough, that building things that worked was its own reward, whether or not anyone knew whose hands had done it." She paused. "That was partly true. The work was always real. The problem was that I started to believe the outcome and the recognition were interchangeable, that someone who received the results was seeing what had created them. They weren't. Those are different things." Vora was quiet for a moment. "What changed?" "Someone reminded me," Ileana said, "in the most thorough way possible, that a person can benefit entirely from what you build and still decide your name belongs nowhere in the record." She looked at the grain storage diagram. After that, the distinction became easier to see. Vora made the sound she made when something landed correctly. Not agreement exactly, recognition. "What I'm learning here," Ileana said, "is how to let both the work and the credit live in the same place. How to say I built this without apologizing for it. That's different from what I was doing before. I'm still learning the shape of it." "You'll learn it," Vora said simply. "You already know more of it than you think. People who have been invisible for a long time sometimes mistake their own clarity for arrogance when they finally start being honest. It isn't arrogance. It's just honesty. Most people are frightened of it because they're not used to hearing it from a woman who has nothing left to lose by speaking plainly." Ileana looked at her. "Did you always talk like this?" "No," Vora said. "I learned it from your grandmother. She was considerably blunter than I am." News from the 5 kingdoms arrived through the settlement's informal networks. Traders passing through. Traveling wolves who stopped for a night and carried pieces of the wider world with them. The quiet intelligence of people who paid attention to everything, because no one expected them to, and therefore no one filtered what they said. What Ileana learned over the following months came in pieces and assembled, slowly, into the picture she had largely predicted when she had been doing the predicting from inside a keep, and trying not to let herself believe she was right. The accord had not collapsed. But it was not the same. The Iron Hello Grain agreement held. She had documented it carefully enough that it ran on its own weight. The Ashvin border arrangement held. The Duskmore trade framework held, partly because Seraphine had more genuine ability than anyone had credited her with, and partly because the structure Ileana had built was sound enough to survive a change in the hands operating it. What changed was more subtle and more significant than any single policy. The pack alphas who had felt the ward shift on the night of the stone, all 5 of them, had spent the following weeks in urgent, frightened correspondence with one another, trying to name what they had felt, trying to understand whether it was a threat, trying to locate its source. Elder Corvin Thassel, she learned from a Duskmore trader 3 months out, had gone personally to the historical archive and begun pulling records. Old records. The ones that had been rewritten 40 years after the original founding. He had been in the archive for 3 weeks, when Kaelin had formally summoned a review of the Accord's founding documentation. What they found there would take them months to process. The name Ashvin appeared in the oldest existing copy of the original Accord, not as a minor house name, but as one of 5 founding bloodlines, alongside Draven, Voss, Ironmere, and Farenthick, all 5 of the families that had been present at the original sealing, all 5 of which had blood representation among the 5 pack alphas, currently seated at the Accord of 5. All of which, every single one, had been standing in the Great Hall watching when Ileana Ashvin signed her name to a dissolution document, and set the quill down, and looked at the assembled court with her face perfectly, terribly still. The implications of what they had done, what Kaylin had done, to a woman of founding bloodline publicly before the full court of the Accord, settled over the 5-pack seats like fog over the valley. Slowly, completely, in a way that required no announcement to make itself felt. Ileana heard this news and felt not triumph, something quieter. She felt vindicated in the same way that the truth is vindicating, not because it punishes anyone, but simply because it is no longer hidden. Seraphine's letter arrived 4 months into her time at the settlement. Ileana read it at the small table in the stone room Vora had given her, with the window open to the morning air. She read it slowly. You do not know me well enough for me to ask anything of you, and I am not asking for forgiveness or friendship. I am writing because I believe you are the kind of person who deserves to know what you could not have seen from where you were standing. I did not choose this position. I was raised toward it, the way some daughters are raised toward certain futures before they are old enough to understand what future means. My father and Elder Thassel were in correspondence about the Valethorn alliance before I had been told the terms. By the time I understood what I was walking into, the contract was 3 drafts deep, and my house's trade position was structurally tied to the outcome. I am not saying this to excuse what happened to you. Nothing excuses it. I am saying it because I know you were in that hall looking at me the way I would have looked at me, as the instrument of something. And I want you to know that instruments do not choose the music they are made to play. I have been learning since you left how to disagree with the men who play me. It is slow work, but I think you may understand what slow work feels like when the stakes are real. I hope you have found ground that belongs to you alone. I hope it is good ground. Seraphine. Ileana read it twice. She sat with it for 3 days. On the 4th day, she wrote back 4 lines. I understand more than you know. What was done to both of us was arranged by people who called it strategy and believed that made it clean. It was not clean, but I think we both already knew that. There is more room in the world for both of us than either of us was shown. I hope you find yours too. She sealed it and sent it, and did not think of the marking with quite the same weight after that. Some wounds did not close because the person who caused them changed. Some closed because you finally understood that the wound had always had more than one person bleeding from it. He came in the 2nd year. She felt him before he appeared, not through any bond, which was long gone and fully silenced, but through the older animal sense that knows weather before it arrives, that reads the particular quality of air before a thing changes. She was in the North Field, working with a wolf named Breck on a drainage problem that had been redirecting spring runoff into the grain stores, when the settlement's boundary watchman found her. Someone at the South Line, he said, alone, no house markings, says he isn't here in any official capacity. She handed off her tools and walked to the boundary line without hurrying. Kaylin stood on the far side of it in traveling clothes, plain, worn, the kind worn by someone who has been on the road long enough to stop caring what riding looks like. 2 years had done something to him that was not simply the passage of time. He had the look of a man who had been taken apart by something, and had done the slow work of putting himself back together, but had been honest enough to acknowledge that some pieces had been permanently changed by the disassembly. He looked at her for a long moment across the boundary line. You're well, he said, not a question. An observation made with the care of a man who had been building toward this single observation for a long time and wanted to get it exactly right. I am, she said. He exhaled, good. He pressed one hand flat against his thigh, a gesture she recognized, the thing he did when he needed to stay still and his body was arguing against it. I needed to see it for myself. The correspondence, he stopped. I didn't trust anything second-hand, not with this. She looked at him steadily. Behind her, the settlement moved through its afternoon, the sound of the river, the voices of wolves building things and tending things, the ordinary productive noise of a place where people had decided to make something out of what remained after the old things ended. The archives, she said. You found the founding records. His jaw tightened. Yes. And you understand what it means. I understand what it means. He held her gaze without flinching away from it. I understand what I did to a woman of founding bloodline in public before the 5 packs. I understand what was in your blood that none of us he stopped again. I acknowledged it formally before the council. Your name is in the official record now. Every reform, every initiative, every policy that runs through this accord that carries your construction, it's documented. In your name. Where anyone who looks will find it. Good, she said. For the accord. Not for me, for the wolves who depend on it so they understand what their peace was actually built on. I know, he was quiet. I didn't come to talk about the record. Why did you come? He took a breath. Because I have spent 2 years sitting with what I did, not explaining it, not constructing arguments for why it was necessary, though God knows I built enough of those in the first 6 months. Something moved through his face that was not the kingship, the man underneath it, undefended. I came to ask if you are all right. That is the whole of it. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about everything she had carried out of Valethorn in 4 journals and a traveling bag. She thought about the settlement's grain store, which she had helped redirect, about Breck and the drainage problem, about Vora's morning fire and the slow, specific pleasure of being known somewhere that had chosen to know her. She thought about Seraphine's letter, and what it had taught her about the difference between an enemy and another person caught in the same machinery. She thought about what it meant to look at a man who had caused her real harm and find, to her own genuine surprise, that she had already done the work of forgiving him, not because he deserved it, but because carrying that weight served no one, least of all herself. I'm more than all right, she said. The breath he released carried 2 years of weight in it. Good, he said very quietly. He started again. I'm glad. Kaelan, she stepped forward, not toward him, just a small shift in the angle between them, a closing of unnecessary distance. What you did with the record, putting the names where they belong, that mattered. Not because it changes what happened, it doesn't, but because the wolves who sit in that council chamber in 30 years will see an honest accounting. They'll know who built what. They'll know what the piece rested on. His jaw worked. It should have been there from the beginning. Yes, she said, it should have. The words settled between them without drama. Not forgiveness exactly. Not an erasing. An accounting, the kind she had always been good at, the kind that named what was true without deciding what it required next. He looked past her at the settlement, the fields, the river bend below the hill. You built something here. I'm helping build it, she said. Vora built it. I just saw where the walls needed tending. That was always. His voice softened into the register she knew from the real hours, the private ones. I always knew what you were doing, Ileana. I just never thought it required my attention. I thought because you were holding things quietly that they were holding themselves. She looked at him. She let herself feel, clearly and without armor, the full reality of the man in front of her, who he had been, what he had cost her, and what he had become across 2 years of sitting honestly with the ruins of a decision he could not undo. She did not love him the way she once had. The bond was gone. She had grieved it fully in the North Field on an ordinary morning, her hand on her chest, until the last thread of it closed. What remained was something that didn't have a clean name, the permanent weight of someone who had mattered enormously, who had also caused real damage, and who had finally done the hard work of understanding both those things at once. She forgave him. She felt it arrive quietly, the way things arrive that have been building for a long time, not a decision reached through argument, a completion. She did not tell him. Forgiveness was not a gift she owed him. It was something she did for herself in the privacy of her own chest, and it would stay there. Go home, she said. Your people need you. Lead them the way you've learned to. She held his gaze. And remember what it cost you to learn it. Don't let it become something you arrange into distance. He looked at her a long moment. Is there nothing left? His voice was low. The question of a man who came prepared to accept the answer but needed to ask it once before he could close the door himself. "There's nothing," she said, not unkindly, with the same precision and care she had brought to every difficult truth in her life. He nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he has received the thing he needed to hear rather than the thing he hoped to hear, and understands that those are sometimes the same answer. He turned and walked back toward the road. She watched him go until he was over the rise and gone from sight. Then she turned back toward the settlement. In the years that followed, the Accord of Five found steadier footing under Kalen's more careful, more honest leadership. He made decisions in council that required real consultation. He credited, in writing, the policies that had come from his advisors. He was not a different man. He was a more honest version of the man he had always been, which is the only real change that lasts. House Ashvin was formally reinstated as a founding bloodline at the Accord of Five's Centennial Review. The historical record was corrected. The founding names were restored. 11 generations of quiet inheritance was acknowledged in writing, in the official documents, where anyone could read it. Ileana was invited to the ceremony. She sent a brief, gracious letter of acknowledgement and did not attend. What had been done with the record was right and good, and had nothing to do with her need to be present at its correction. Seraphine Voss, as it turned out, had a genuine talent for Southern diplomacy that grew steadily in the years after Ileana's departure. She became, in time, the kind of Luna who made decisions in rooms rather than in corridors after the decisions had already been made. She and Ileana exchanged letters twice a year. Brief, honest, the correspondence of two women who had been arranged against each other and had decided to arrange themselves differently. At the settlement past the boundary markers, the thing Vora had built and Ileana now helped tend kept growing. Not because Ileana needed to prove anything to a world that had once decided her name didn't belong in any record, but because she was good at this work, and she had finally found ground that let her be good at it without conditions attached. By the fourth year, the settlement held 60 wolves. They came from packs that had named them inconvenient, courts that had found them replaceable, mates who had signed documents in public and called it strategy. They arrived defined by their losses. Slowly, at their own pace, learning to define themselves instead by what they were willing to build next. Ileana did not tell them her history in full. Most of them learned pieces of it through time and proximity, the way people in small places come to know each other. She never corrected the gaps. What she had been was not the whole of what she was now. What she was now was something she chose every morning, deliberately, without reference to the title she no longer carried or the bond she no longer wore. She rose before the settlement woke. She stood at the east window in the gray light before sunrise and watched the color come back into the hills, and she felt, in the particular quality of that silence, the exact shape of who she had become. A woman who had given a kingdom everything she had to give. A woman who had known, finally, when to stop giving. A woman who had walked out of a keep with nothing but 4 journals and a traveling bag, and had found, on the far side of everything, that the thing she was carrying had never belonged to the keep in the first place. It had always been hers. The iron-heavy soil on the eastern slope of the settlement's hill, which most things refused to grow in easily, bloomed every spring with pale river grass, and the wild silver flower that her grandmother had called thornbloom, named not for pain, but for the way it came back from the most difficult ground harder and more permanent than anything grown in easier soil. She had planted it on purpose. She had always known exactly what she was choosing to grow. On a morning in the 4th spring, she stood at the east window and watched the light climb the hills and felt, not happiness in the simple way of songs, not the clean joy of someone for whom no difficult thing had ever happened. Something more lasting than happiness. She was whole. That is the thing no one tells you about surviving a thing like this. It is not the moment of the stone, or the night you walk through a gate with bare hands, or the morning you feel the last thread of a bond finally close. Survival is the 1,000 ordinary mornings that come after, the work you choose because you want it, the ground you build because it is yours, the person you become once no one else is left to decide who you are. Outside, the thorn bloom moved in the early wind, bending and coming back up, bending and coming back, the way things do when they have been planted in difficult ground by someone who understood completely, without question or apology, exactly what she was choosing to grow. She turned from the window. The settlement was waking. The river was running below the hill exactly as it had run every morning since before the accord, before the pax, before any king had sat in any stone hall and decided whose name belonged in which record. Steady and indifferent and entirely unbothered. She had learned at last to move at the river's pace. Forward, simply because forward was where the water was always going. And she had finally, after everything, learned to go with it. The 5 alphas who felt the ward shift on that night never fully agreed on what it was. Some called it a geological event. Some called it an echo of old magic. One, the Iron Hello matriarch, who had been paying closer attention than the rest, wrote in her private correspondence that it felt like a woman finally putting down something too heavy for one person to carry alone. She was the only one who got it exactly right. If this story reached you, drop your city below. I want to know how many kingdoms this found tonight.